Want to welcome you back and invite those of you who are standing to find a chair. We've got some additional folks with us here tonight. I'm going to do what good preachers do when they don't have anyone's attention. Would you stand with me? Let's pray. Would you bow your heads? God, we thank you for the good afternoon we've already had. And as we move into this evening, we ask that you would continue to give us insights on leadership. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Please be seated. Our evening is, this evening, our time together, that's the word I was looking for. Our time consists basically in dialoguing with Walter Wright about leadership. Many of you have already read his bio in the program and know that he is a senior fellow at the Max Dupree Center for Leadership down in Pasadena. He was actually also the executive director there for 12 years. Prior to that, Walter was the president of Regent College just north of here, up in Vancouver, college affiliated with University of British Columbia. And then prior to that, he was back down in Pasadena at Fuller Theological Seminary, working there with the management team. You probably also had a chance to see on his bio that he's written several books. And actually, when Tom Neese first mentioned Walter Wright to me, the word that jumped out at me right off the bat was the word relational. Walter has in several book titles or subtitles the word relational, and he cares a lot about relational leadership, which we've already heard from our panel sessions and discussions already. Also, I found out from talking with Walter that he and I share a love for the outdoors. He's not so much a backpacker like I am, he's a mountain climber, and I'm sure in either his talk tonight or his workshop tomorrow, some of the mountain climbing metaphors will slip into what he has to say. It's a real, genuine pleasure to have Walter Wright with us this evening, and I wonder if you would join with me in welcoming him.
Can I move this without doing damage? Yeah. Well, it is good to be here with you, even though it's late and we've been busy in meetings, and I always hate to disrupt good conversations just to have more of a monological one, but maybe I won't talk too long, and then we can have questions and conversation about anything you want to talk about. I have never been here before, so it's really good for me to visit your campus. I feel like I know you a bit because my father's family were all Nazarene, and my wife's mother's family were all Nazarene. So I grew up as a kid hearing about Nampa like it was some kind of Mecca. Now I've been here, so I know what they're talking about. And it turns out I had to walk over to dinner tonight with Randy, one of the district superintendents, and he's staying at my brother-in-law's house tonight that I didn't realize is 10 blocks from here. So after tonight, I need to go drop in and have a visit. But it is good to be with you, and I'd like to talk a little bit about leadership tonight. We'll get mountains into it, but we'll save the mountaineering metaphor primarily for tomorrow in the workshop. 3 weeks before this institution, your school, was founded, Charlie Houston was born. Almost to the day, 3 weeks before. And he died September 3 years ago. Does that name mean anything to anybody here? Anybody heard of Charlie Houston? Yeah, so I'm not surprised. I hadn't until he showed up in some of the mountaineering literature that I was reading. Charlie Houston was a professor of medicine at the University of Vermont. He was very active with the Peace Corps and was director for the National Peace Corps work in India. And he was a mountain climber, and that's kind of where he came into my purview. He's known for the teams that he built, the kind of mountain climbing teams that he established. He's known as a question asker, always exploring new areas and new adventures, things that needed to be discovered, and he's known as a failure. And I thought Charlie Houston is a good place for us to start, because he's known primarily in the mountaineering literature for his failure to climb K2. And he, during the same year that Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay climbed Mount Everest, Charlie Houston was leading an expedition of K2, which is the second highest mountain in the world and a more difficult mountain than Mount Everest. And on that particular climb, a friend of his got violently ill, and because of that relationship, he aborted the climb and went through a heroic effort to try to save his friend's life and get him off the mountain. And that heroic effort has gone down as one of the legends of the mountaineering world, known as the Schoening Belay. And Pete Schoening was one of the young climbers on that particular trip. And Charlie put together teams of highly relational, connected people committed to one another. And this was Pete Schoening's first serious climb, but they had a huge disaster on the way down, and Pete Schoening stopped 6 adult climbers, highly skilled climbers, from falling to their death by grabbing onto the rope and throwing himself down on the ice, and held these 6 climbers, all of whom fell off the mountain, and held them secure until they regained consciousness, were able to get back up onto their feet and get back out. That ice axe that he used to stop the fall is in a museum in Colorado because of the skill of that one belay. And he illustrated the power of the relational connection of being roped up. That's the metaphor I'll kind of unpack tomorrow in the workshop, the rope as metaphor for the leadership relationship. Charlie Houston organized it. He put together teams based on close relationships. He always chose people who were committed to one another over people who had reputation and status. And he figured if he had a strong team of people, it's a little bit like Tom was alluding to in the panel this afternoon. If you have a strong team of people, they're going to be able to emerge in support of a good vision. And Charlie built strong teams. His biography was called The Brotherhood of the Rope because of his emphasis on relationships and commitment to one another. And for me, the mountain climbing rope is a very powerful metaphor for the leadership relationship, because leaders and followers are tied together. And that's something you'll hear me say pretty much any time that I talk. Leaders and followers are tied together, and the rope makes that clear, makes it very visible. We are connected. There is no such thing as a leader without a follower. Charlie Houston exercised relational leadership with a clear sense of purpose and vision. I wouldn't use calling for him like we would in our Christian language, but he had visions, and he pursued his visions with determined purpose and deep personal character. And he asked questions. He asked the questions that created the space for other people then to enter into the questions, to engage the questions, and to build on his failures. Because he's best known for what he almost accomplished, for his failures. He almost climbed Nanda Devi, this beautiful mountain in the Indian Himalayas. He put together the expedition that others were able to take to the summit. He almost climbed Mount Everest. He's the one that opened the southern route that everybody now uses to climb Mount Everest, but did not make it to the summit. He almost climbed K2 and turned back because of the death of his friend. He almost discovered high-altitude pulmonary edema, which is how mountain climbers die from the elevation impact on their lungs. He did all the preliminary research that others then built on to save hundreds of lives in climbing circles. And he almost invented the artificial heart, designing the primitive models that others then took and built into medical miracles before the day of heart transplant. And so he's known for asking questions and then failing to deliver on them, but asking questions in a way that created space for others to step in, pick up the question, and take it forward. And I think that's one of the significant characteristics of leadership. He was invited by a university to come and speak to the graduating class in commencement. And he wrote back and he said, "Why do you want me? I've failed at everything I've set out to do." And the dean wrote back this memo: "You're ideal. You've had an unusually varied life. You've tried all sorts of activities, and you've done so many interesting things. But most important, you've failed in all of them, over and over again. I think the graduating class would be inspired by your philosophy. You keep coming back. You keep trying again. You never give up. A man of vision, a man of character, a man committed to relationships." He asked the questions that others built on. So I have some questions for you. And I encourage you to take a minute and write down an initial answer. You can talk about them in your groups at other times. What's the most important thing in life to you? How would you answer that question? What's the most important thing in life to you? Second question, what gets you up in the morning, other than a cup of coffee? What gets you up in the morning? Why do you do what you do? What if you didn't get up? Who cares? For whom are you important? For whom is it important that you get up tomorrow morning? I hope you're writing down answers, not just writing down the questions. I will say, too, I'm going to throw a lot of slides and stuff up here. You may not want to write any of it down, you don't have to. But at the end, I'll give you my email address, and anybody that wants the slides, I'll just send me an email and I'll send it to you as attachment, so you don't have to write down anything that's there. So what if you didn't get up? To whom are you important? And then, what happens when you fail? What happens when you fail? I think these are 4 critical questions of leadership. First question is the question of character. Who are you? What's important to you? What are the beliefs, the values, the commitments, the promises that shape the person you are? Because who you are, what you believe, what you're committed to, ultimately shapes your behavior. And it impacts everyone that you seek to influence, everyone upon whom you are exercising leadership. Second question begins to get at calling. How do you define the trajectory of your journey through life? Who have you been called to be? How do you see your vision unfolding? And that purpose that drives your life basically energizes your visions. And you're going to have a variety of visions along your journey, but those visions are kind of all energized by your sense of calling and purpose. Why are you here? Why do you get up in the morning? What calls you? What drives you forward? And then relationships. And as Tom said, that's one of my highest values. We are relational beings. It's in our DNA. I mean, we were created, I think I said earlier today, we're created by relationships, for relationships. Our life is about relationship. Leadership is a relationship. My definition of leadership is simple. Leadership is a relationship of influence in which one person seeks to influence the vision, the values, the attitudes, or the behaviors of another. That's it. It's a relationship of influence. It's not a title. It's not a position. It's a relationship, and it's about influence, and we'll come back to that. Faith is a relationship, and I had a chance to read the book Tom edited about relational theology, and our relationship with God is the source of our faith. And the legacy you leave is going to be through the relationships. Max Dupree says that your legacy is what's left in the mind of others after you're gone. And so the people with whom you have been in relationship. And then questions, the power of questions. And hopefully we'll just use questions throughout today and tomorrow. Questions create space. They create space for creativity to happen. Answers limit space, if you think about it. Questions open space, and they allow people to take ownership for answers. They allow adaptive strategies to to emerge, and they allow diversity to be embraced and recognized. Questions are one of the most powerful tools that leaders have. It's the way we learn, and it's the way we teach in our leadership roles. So, as we work out our calling, leadership then flows from our character, our beliefs, our values. It expands in the relationships in which we seek to influence others, and it frames the questions that creates the space then for others to learn and to make their contribution. Now, my favorite biblical leader is Moses. I like Moses for 3 reasons, and they're all up there. He didn't think he was big enough for the job gave him. Well, most of us have felt that way at times. Whatever he did, the people grumbled. I identify with that. I know what he's talking about. No matter what he did, the people grumbled. And when they weren't grumbling, they were complaining about something else. I mean, he had this tension with people that is very realistic. But what I really like about Moses is he was a mountain climber. Moses climbed mountains. And the leadership truths that I draw from Moses' life can all be summarized by the mountains that he climbed. Because Moses climbed Mount Horeb, the hill over Rephidim, Mount Sinai, Mount Pisgah. And he should have climbed Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. But he didn't. So let's look at what we learn about leadership from Moses and the mountains. Oh, I have one Moses comment too. It has to do with your city. I walked twice now up the street here and crossed 12th Avenue, which is a fairly busy street. And I'm from California. I'm not used to cars stopping. It was like the parting of the Red Sea. I stepped up to that crosswalk, all the cars just form a wall, and I get to walk across. Well, that doesn't happen in California. You're lucky if they stop at stop signs. They don't stop for people. So I had a little Moses experience right here in your neighborhood. So what do I draw from Moses when I think about leadership? Well, I guess before I jump to that, let's talk about. That's not where I thought I was going. Okay. Well, let's talk about Moses. You know the Moses story. That's a familiar one to all of us. He was abandoned as a child. He was adopted by a family of a different race. He was educated in the finest schools and trained to be a leader. He had an opportunity to exercise leadership when he saw an injustice occurring, and so he inserted himself into the situation, exercised leadership, ends up killing an Egyptian officer, now is feared by his people rather than respected by them, and becomes a fugitive from Pharaoh. So he has to flee as an outlaw, and he takes up his career then, 40 years as a sheep herder out in the desert. And of course, it's while he's doing his work as a sheep herder that he sees a bush on fire, and he hears the call of God. I take 5 principles from Moses' life that I think are helpful for me to think about leadership. First, leadership is not about us. It's about the God that we choose to follow. God is the leader. We are not the leaders. Second, leadership is a team activity. It only exists in relationship. And we'll talk more about each of these. 3, the culture we create is a strategic asset. And we alluded to culture a little bit during the panel time. The culture that's created by your leadership is a strategic asset that's going to enable you to achieve your mission or not achieve your mission. And I would like to argue that for those of you who are in Christian organizations and the church, the culture is part of your mission, a significant part of your mission. And leading change is dangerous. If you're going to be a leader and you're going to be involved in change leadership, it's going to cost you something. So that means that without forgiveness, there will be no leadership. So these are the 5 primary truths that I take from Moses. God is the leader, not us. Leadership is a team activity. It's a relationship of at least 2 people. The culture you create is a strategic component in your leadership responsibilities, but the very act of leading culture and creating change is dangerous to you as a leader, and forgiveness is going to be necessary to make that possible. So, Mount Horeb, the first mountain that Moses climbs. We all know Mount Horeb pretty well. He sees this burning bush, he goes over to the burning bush, and he hears this voice out of the bush. Take off your sandals, Moses, you're on holy ground. And the dialogue then begins with God. Holy ground. Moses is not in church. He's out herding sheep. He's doing his work. He's at work. His equivalent of wherever your office is, wherever you spend your time. And God says, you're on holy ground, Moses. Take off your shoes. Pay attention. And he hears this call of God. Go, set my people free. Go, give my people opportunity to become who I intend them to be and to be able to contribute to the community of the people of God. And Moses' response is the primal question of leadership. It's exactly the question that I would want to ask if I were Moses. Who, me? I can't go do this. Who do you think? Who am I, God, that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should go to Egypt? I think that's the primal question of leadership that we all ask. Who am I that I should take on this assignment? And of course, God responds, wrong question, and responds with what I would call the question of primal leadership. The real question is who I am. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm going to Pharaoh. I'm going to Egypt. Follow me. And so in that little exchange, the question of Moses about himself and his inability gets reframed to be a question about God and the leadership of God and the followership of Moses. So the truths then that I would pull out of Horeb, wherever we are with God is holy ground. You don't have to wait. We happen to be in a church facility. It's not required. You don't have to wait for Sunday. Your office, this room, your family, your home, wherever you work, your classroom, anywhere you are with God is holy ground. That's where it starts, is to recognize that we're on holy ground all the time. And that's kind of the beginning. Second is that the call of God is to set free the people of God, to give them the space to become who they can be. It's the call then that defines everything that we do. It's the call to follow and to invest ourselves in serving the people of God. Leadership then flows out of followership. We really become leaders because we choose to follow the leader. And we live in a world that's looking desperately for leaders, and I think we lead most profoundly when we're seen to follow. And so people are looking to see who we follow, what we follow, and whether they should accept our influence, our leadership. We're on holy ground. We've been called to set free the people of God, and our leadership is going to flow out of the fact that we become followers of the leader, and that belief precedes our behavior. I like this little phrase, and I use it a lot. Belief precedes behavior. That's a Max Dupree phrase, and he argues that at Herman Miller Furniture Company. Belief precedes behavior. What you believe, and I'll kind of unpack this one a little bit more in the workshop, but what you believe, really believe, not what you say you believe, what you really believe shapes what you do. It shows up in your behaviors. And all the research says you can trace that right down to the productivity of your outcomes and your mission. Your beliefs matter. Your character, your commitments matter deeply. It's going to shape what you do. Moses' encounter with God at that burning bush shaped the rest of his life and all of his behaviors that flowed from that encounter. Then there's the hill over Rephidim. Remember this story at all? This one isn't quite as familiar as Sinai and Horeb. This is when the Amalekites attacked the Israelites. And Joshua takes the troops into the valley of Rephidim to fight the Amalekites. Moses then goes up onto the mountaintop, the hill looking out over the valley of Rephidim, and lifts Joshua and the troops up before God, lifting his arms to heaven. And as long as Moses' arms are in the air, Joshua's winning the battle. When Moses' arms come down, the Israelites are losing the battle. And Moses is only human. He can't keep his arms up. He gets tired. And the battle is in serious jeopardy until Aaron and Hur exert some leadership step in, sit Moses down on a rock, come in and stand alongside of him, and each one holds up an arm. And as long as they're holding up Moses' arms, Joshua is able to defeat the Amalekites, which is kind of a beautiful illustration that we can't do this alone. God doesn't ask us to do it alone. He sends us out with Aaron's and hers to help us accomplish whatever it is he calls us to do. And then there's this wonderful little statement at the end of that story, and what God says to Moses, write this down and make sure Joshua hears it. Well, what's that about? Write this down and make sure Joshua hears it. Well, Joshua is being mentored, being groomed to be the next leader of Israel. And God wants to make sure that Joshua knows he didn't defeat the Amalekites. God defeated the Amalekites with Joshua and the Israelites and Aaron and Moses and Hur. It took all of them. And he wants to make sure Joshua understands that. Write this down and make sure that Joshua reads it. I am the leader of Israel. So the truths then that I would pull out of Rephidim, leadership is a relationship. And I've already defined it as a relationship of influence. It's always a relationship of influence. It's not a position. And actually, I have a cute little story here about my grandson that I like to tell right here, but I'm going to save that for tomorrow. So you got to come back if you want to hear the story. But it's not a position. It's nothing about your charisma or your person. It's a relationship of influence, and it only happens when somebody chooses to follow. And that's an important truth. We have a tendency to think leaders are so important. I actually don't like to talk about leaders. I'd rather talk about leadership. And leadership only happens when someone chooses to accept your influence. And if you think about it that way, if leadership really rests in the hands of the one who chooses to accept my influence, then leadership rests in the hands of followers, not in our hands. We may be the leader, we may have responsibility to move the mission forward, but whether we are able to exert leadership or not is going to be totally determined by whether someone chooses to follow. And of course, all the research says they choose to follow because of your character, your beliefs, the person that you present, your integrity. Leadership is a team activity. It's made up of multiple people. That's why I like the mountaineering rope metaphor so much. It makes it very clear that we're tied together. There's no such thing as a leader without a follower. In my classes, I'll bring ropes and I'll tie people up and put them on a rope just so they have to feel the connection. We don't know how to talk about relationships, but if you suddenly realize you're tied to the person next to you, that relationship becomes quite palpable. We need to feel leadership that way. We're tied to each other. We need each other. It's a team activity. And these three truths, relationship, team commitment, and the fact that it's the choice resides with the follower, are becoming very important as our organizations are changing. And that came up several times in comments that both Toms made and that came out in the panels. Organizations are flattening. The old day of hierarchy organizations doesn't exist in very many places except Tom's Military Academy. They're flattening. We're working as teams, work groups, matrix organizations. Everybody works together now. And so you have very little authority with which to conduct anything anymore. And we have to work within this much more dispersed leadership roles. In fact, if you think of team leadership, one of the characteristics of leadership on a team is that it's dispersed. It's passed around. Everybody leads. Once you're on the rope, you're automatically a leader because every person on the rope has the ability to influence everyone else on the rope. So just by definition, everybody exercises leadership. We're also moving into a time that has been alluded to several times today where organizations are becoming much more complex. And this is one that I'm still struggling with, so I don't know how much I want to say here. But the complexity is getting much greater because these generational changes that we've alluded to today are all still occurring within individual organizations. And so while I don't like labels, you got the so-called boomer group, and they're basically moving into the third of life, as I like to call it, or retirement, as it has traditionally been called, at 10,000 a day. And boomers have been very success-oriented. They've been very committed to sacrifice if necessary for the sake of the mission and the accomplishment of what they wanted to do. And they're retiring now, but they want to stay engaged. And so you got boomers involved, wanting to figure out ways to stay involved as coaches, mentors, participants along the edges. And then those of you that fall into the quote, Gen X category are the ones now assuming the leadership responsibility for our organizations and our churches. And this particular cohort has been pretty well ignored by the boomers. And so they're suddenly coming up, finding themselves needing to step into leadership roles, and they're not so sure they want to do it. Because they've got a little more realistic expectation now on what they can expect from organizations, and they know the organizations are not going to take care of them, and so they're not certain if they really want to sacrifice their freedom and independence and family time in order to help an organization achieve its mission. And so you've got an almost reluctant cohort of people being drafted into the leadership roles now. And that's significant because in the next 10 years, the estimates are that almost 1 million senior leadership positions will turn over in nonprofit organizations in the United States. That's a huge leadership turnover, and it's the Gen X and millennial generations that are going to step into these roles, and they come in with a little bit of ambivalence and reluctance about giving up freedom and space to take on this responsibility. And the Gen X group has a lot of trouble understanding the millennial group coming along, those of you, the students, the younger ones here. Because the Gen X group are so entrepreneurial that by and large you don't want to work for anybody. You kind of want to do your own thing. And you are creative and innovative, and you want the freedom to do it, and so you don't want to be managed. And now you're responsible to manage the next group coming along who want to be managed. Because the millennials expect to be managed, and expect to be managed in a way that lets them contribute today, to have their say today and be able to have an impact on the organization now, and then grow into their contribution in the future. So we got 3 generations currently at play in our organizations, and they have different attitudes toward relationship, which is part of the complexity here too. I'm clearly old school, as was referred to today. For me, relationship basically starts with face-to-face stuff. Gen Xers, because of their desire to protect their space and freedom, have been much more leaning toward telephone and email to kind of protect their own privacy, and then increasingly now they're moving toward texting. The millennials come along, they're completely wired, and they're connected with everything, and they live on the internet. They go online for anything they want to learn. And relationships are very much digitally connected for them. In fact, I'd like to do a little survey. How many of you would say one of your primary means of communication is tweeting? No tweeters in here? How many of you tweet? Okay, I knew we had to get some out of the student generation here. I have never tweeted in my life. I haven't the slightest idea how to do that. How about texting? Oh, yeah, okay, so texting is caught on. Anybody still do email? Yeah, good, because that's the way I do it. Did anybody sit down and talk to anyone face-to-face anymore? All right. But we got 4 different ways of relating that are going on simultaneously and communicating. And if we're going to accept leadership in our organizations, our churches, our communities, we're going to have to learn how to communicate across those cultural boundaries, if you will, and to understand how each of the different generations hears and is influenced and responds to that influence. My 3 grandsons there were ready for a bad hair day, or a hair day at school anyway, but they illustrated 2 little stories I have. One's humorous, one's not so humorous, about the change in cultures. The grandsons were being picked up from school by their grandmother, and she drove them home, and one of the boys asked her a question, and she didn't know the answer, and she said, I don't know the answer to that. And so Brendan, the oldest one, 12 years old at the time, said, well, Nanik, when I get home, I'll Google it and tweet you the answer. And she said, now, Brendan, you know that I don't know how to text or tweet. And Lucas, the middle grandson, just incredulously blurted out, what? You don't know how to text? And she said, no, and it's not on my bucket list to learn before I die. Which prompted the 7-year-old to say, well, make sure Magic Mountain is. So, different generational ways of seeing reality, and we've got to work within them. I mean, we may not be tweeters, but we've got to learn how to talk and communicate and influence the people who are looking to us for leadership. The other question does concern me, and I don't have an answer for this one. I have good friends who would fall probably into the boomer category that have a millennial child who's having a lot of trouble with drugs, serious trouble with drugs. And they're trying to communicate about this. And all of the communication is being done by text and tweet. They won't sit down and talk. The child will not sit down in a face-to-face conversation. That worries me. I mean, this stuff is too deep to do in whatever number of characters you're limited to in tweeting, or a quick sentence or two off in texting. These are deep emotional things. How are we going to communicate at these kind of levels? And that one I don't have an answer to, but it concerns me. But we're leading organizations that have all of this complexity in them now. And we need to figure out how we're going to listen to the other person, understand how they are influenced, how they choose to accept influence, and how we can serve them in reaching the mission. Then the final truth I would pull out of the valley of Rephidim, the hill over Rephidim, is the mentoring question. And we alluded to that one during the panel. Like Moses and Joshua, mentoring prepares the next generation of leaders. All of us should be involved in mentoring relationships, both ways. We've been running mentoring seminars for years now, and everybody signs up to come to these seminars so they can be trained as mentors. And what we end up having to do is retool them to go out and think about managing mentors for their own growth and development. Mentoring starts with what you want to learn next and grow in, and then how you find people to help you along the journey. And as you're doing that, you will become a resource that others would look to as a mentor on their journey. Fridtjof Nansen. Does that name mean anything to anybody? Got to have to be a Norwegian probably to recognize that name. That's a new one I just run into, and I'm going to do something with that, but just as a throwaway comment here. Anybody that read the book, I think it's Great by Choice, Jim Collins' newest book, he has at the beginning of his book a comparison of the journey of Robert Falcon Scott and Roald Amundsen in the race to the South Pole. Do those names mean anything to you? Amundsen and Scott. How about Shackleton? Those names we all know. But I got inspired by Collins' little introductory thing there, and I went and read the biographies then of Amundsen, Shackleton, and Scott, and was surprised to see that each of those three men had the same mentor, Fridtjof Nansen. And I just finished a 600-page biography of Fridtjof Nansen, who's an incredibly fascinating man, and something that I've got to figure out what to do with. There's a story there to unpack. But of those three people going to the same man as mentor, two of them listened to their mentor and one didn't. And Scott, of course, died on the return from the North Pole because he dismissed the wisdom of the mentor that he'd been working with. Max Dupree, I've alluded already today that I have for over 30 years now been working with Max Dupree as a mentor in my life, and he has shaped everything that I am and that I do, and has been a marvelous gift from God in terms of giving me wisdom, an opportunity to learn from his wisdom on my leadership journey. And the two things that Max does consistently, and these are almost the two primary tools of mentors: stories and questions. Max tells stories out of his own experience, not for me to have to do or anything, just shares his experience in story, which allows me then to figure out how I would apply that to my own struggles and journey. And then he asks me the questions that I have to take ownership for answering as I begin to frame my own journey into who I intend to be. As these 10,000 people a day are moving into what I call the third of life, they are ripe to be mentors. And so I want to set that group aside and I want to say to them, you've got all this accumulated wisdom. Make yourself available for the people moving into leadership roles in our organizations and the emerging leaders just beginning to get onto the leadership track. We've got to turn this pool of boomers that are retiring into mentors and volunteers and board members for our organizations. But then what I want to say to the Gen Xers is, yes, they have ignored you, all of this. And in fact, one of the things that really irritates me is that all of the mentoring programs now are boomer groups leaping over to mentor the millennials, the young ones coming along. And these people that have got to pick up responsibilities for the organizations are being ignored. This is the group that's got to bear the burden of our organizations for the next 10 years. We've got to help them become the best leaders they possibly can be for the kingdom of God. And so what I want to say to this group that's moving into that yes, you have been ignored, but you're responsible for your own leadership development now. So figure out what the next thing is you need to learn, and then find out who might be a good resource to help you learn. Don't go ask them to be your mentor. That's like asking somebody for marriage on the first date. I always say, forget the M word. It just gets you in trouble. Go ask them to have lunch with you. Ask them if you could buy them lunch and they would talk to you a little bit about their experience in this journey. And just keep doing that. And eventually you'll call it a mentoring relationship as you begin to learn from them. You're responsible for your mentors, not the other way around. Warren Bennis has said at one point that one of the marks of leadership is your ability to recruit and retain mentors in your life. We're responsible for our own leadership development, and mentors are there as resources for us. And so there's especially this huge pool now in the third of life. And I wrote a book on the third of life, Preparing for Your Future. And again, Moses was 80 at the burning bush. He was just at the third of his life. All of this history that we know about Moses all happened in his retirement stage. He'd already finished his 40-year career as a sheep farmer, and now he's in retirement, out climbing mountains and leading another herd of sheep across the desert. Okay, Mount Sinai, the next one. Another mountain we know quite well as a story. So what happens at Mount Sinai? 3 things. Our organizational systems fail us. People let us down. We're reminded again that God is the leader. God is the one that we follow. And we are told that the way we lead and the way we live is as important as the mission we pursue. And that's an important one for me. The way we lead, the way we live, is as important as the mission that we are pursuing. So the leadership truths then that I want to pull out of Sinai, and you know what happened at Sinai. I mean, Moses goes up to get the 10 Commandments. Miriam and Aaron think he's gone. The people think he's gone too long. Miriam's a little discouraged that she didn't get a big enough leadership role. Aaron's feeling like he's got to do something to keep the people happy. So they build the golden calf and they create this imitation God. And Moses comes down and in anger breaks the tablets and has to go back up and get some more. And God points out that Moses, it's not you they're rejecting. It's me. It's the God that Moses follows that's being rejected by the people. God is the leader, not us. And we'll come back to the fact that it's very dangerous to think it's about us. God is the leader. We follow. The story also reminds us that every person we add on our team brings strengths and weaknesses. Miriam and Aaron and Hur added a lot to Moses' work and leadership. But they also brought their own insecurities, their own needs, their own weaknesses, their own failures. That's going to be true of everybody that you seek to lead. Everybody that you put on your team is going to bring strengths to the team and weaknesses to the team. And we manage that by complementing their weaknesses, by teaming them with people who have complementary strengths. And we bring people together because everybody contributes. When I was thinking about that Rephidim story of Moses with the arms up and Aaron and Hur, We know all about Moses. Most of us know a lot about Aaron. We don't know anything about her. But what if Hur had let down on the job? What if Hur hadn't been able to hold Moses' arms up? And then the Israelites had lost to the Amalekites, and where would we be today? I mean, we needed Hur there holding the arms up. Everybody has this role to play. And most of us will spend more of our life as Hurs than as Moses's. But Hur has an important role to play for the kingdom of God and for God's work in this world. God is the leader, we follow. The people we seek to lead bring strengths and weaknesses to the table. The culture we create is a strategic asset. 10 commandments are given at Sinai. And I look at that and I see a framework for a way of life, what life in the community of the people of God is supposed to look like. Basically, it's defining a culture, a way of living together. And I said earlier today that that was one of my passions and concerns, how we live together. Does the way we live together, well, the way we live together does point to the God that we follow. So what God is pointing to is the question we need to be asking. And at Sinai, we're given a model for how we are to live together, honoring God, honoring one another, respecting people. And the culture then becomes critical to the mission we've been called to do. In many ways, the promised land is not a geographical location. It's a way of living together in God's presence. So in a lot of ways, the promised land is how we live together, not where we live. And Sinai begins to spell that out for us. Tomorrow I'll spend a little more time in the workshop kind of unpacking the relationship between culture and mission. Because the culture you create, the culture you are creating, see, as the leader you are creating culture. You are the most watched person in your church, in your organization. And every single thing you do is teaching theology all day long. Always. You're never off duty. That's the danger of being a leader. You're never off duty. And it's being embedded in the culture of your organization and your church. And that culture, as all the research shows us, shapes the strategies and the productivity of your mission. So the culture you create is going to have a direct impact on your ability to achieve the mission that you set out to do. So culture is not a secondary thing. I'll argue tomorrow that it's actually more important than vision in terms of accomplishing what we want to do together. Culture is critical. And as leaders, you teach theology all day long. You're never done. I keep hitting leaders over the head with this one because you're never off duty. You could make the greatest sermon in the world on Sunday morning, but if you mistreat somebody on the way out of the church, you have just taught a different lesson. I could hear the most profound faculty member speak in a class or in chapel and then mistreat the receptionist or the faculty secretary when they go by. It negates everything that's been said. Your behaviors become embedded in the culture and you're teaching theology. I do a lot of workshops and seminars for business CEOs. I make the same statement to them. They may not be believers, and I don't say they have to be believers, but they are teaching theology all day long because they are living out of what's important to them. And this is critical because what's important to you as a leader is shaping your behaviors. The people who look to you for leadership are watching and adapting their behaviors based on watching you and then taking that elsewhere. Jean Lippman Blumen, and I'm probably getting ahead and stealing stuff from tomorrow, but Jean Lippman Blumen has a couple of really good books, and in one of them, Connective Leadership, she talks about the fact that every human being is on a journey, trying to figure out how do I navigate life in the face of the fact that death hangs at the end. And we're all in this together. We're all trying to figure out, so how do I live my life with meaning, given the fact that there's an end point to it? And she said that creates this sense of anxiety that we have. So what we do as humans, and Jean is not a believer in the sense that we would understand it. She's a wonderful person. But Jean would say that what we do, I got to back up, I sidetracked on that. she would say that because we're in this anxiety, we look to the people that we respect around us as leaders to see how they are making decisions in life. We watch their decisions and we factor them into our own decision-making processes and then behave accordingly. And so your work as a leader, your actions as a leader are being watched by the people who see you as leader, are being filtered into their own decision-making processes, shaping their behaviors, and then shaping the way they impact their family, their neighbors, and the larger community. So everything you do matters all the way out to the end. I mean, it's a heavy trip, but it goes along with leadership. If you're going to be a leader, you're on duty all the time. And the promised land then is how we live together before God. Okay, what about Mount Pisgah? Remember Mount Pisgah? What happens at Mount Pisgah? God takes Moses to the top of Mount Pisgah and shows him the promised land. And he gets to see out of the promised land. And he sees Gerizim and Ebal out in the promised land. And Gerizim is the mountain that when the people of Israel get to Israel, they're going to go onto the top of the mountain and proclaim the blessings of God over the people of God. And then the leader goes on to Mount Ebal and will proclaim the curses of God over the people of God. Those are the two mountains Moses was supposed to go climb, but Moses doesn't get to go into Israel. He doesn't get to go to the promised land. He has to stay out. And why? Because he put himself between God and the people. At Meribah, remember the story at Meribah? The people are grumbling again. They're thirsty once again. And God says, just speak to the rock. The rock will send out water. Thirst will be quenched. Everything will be happy. But Moses hears all this grumbling, and he begins to take it personally. And so he gets angry, and he strikes the rock, smashes it twice, and God says, no. They're not arguing about you. They're arguing about me. This is not about you. You don't go to the promised land for that one act. Anytime we put ourselves between the people we lead and the God we follow, we have just entered very dangerous ground. It's God who is the leader. We are there to keep people focused on that. And Moses got in the way. Now, there's some serious truths, I think, that come out of the Pisgah mountain for me. Adaptive change evokes resistance. If you think about it, Moses is really trying to change the culture of the Israelites. If you've read anything by Ron Heifetz, you know the difference between adaptive challenges and technical change. Adaptive challenges are when we have to get somebody to change the way they do things, their beliefs, their values, their assumptions. It's dealing with these core processes with which we live and process reality. Technical change are the fixes. When we repair something, we fix something, we make a decision. And adaptive change requires people to give something up. And adaptive change always evokes resistance. It creates pain. It creates loss. And that loss then gets grieved and causes an attack to come. And people then tend to attack the leader. And part of what we have to understand in leadership, if you're really going to change culture, that's adaptive change. If you're going to change culture, if you're going to try to create a kingdom culture that's healthy for your people and points to God, you can expect resistance because you're asking people to change. And the hard thing is to remember that resistance is not personal. It's not really about you. It's their own natural, normal feeling of change, resistance at the change that you're asking them to make. It's not about us. Part of the role of leadership, then, is to create space for people to be able to express the pain and the loss that's going on as you ask them to change the culture, and then to absorb the pain without taking it personally. That's not very easy to do, but it's part of our job as leaders. We're creating change that evokes resistance, gets expressed as pain, gets directed at us. We have to absorb it without letting it become a personal thing for us, keeping people focused on the God that we're seeking to follow and why this change is critical. We create safe space for people to express it, and we absorb the pain. And Moses was asking a lot for the Israelites. I mean, they may have complained a lot in Egypt, but they knew where dinner was coming from. Now they're out in the middle of the desert. They don't know where they're going. They don't have anything to eat. There's no water. This is a massive change to learn to trust God to take care of them in this wilderness area. He's redefining their culture, and this is hard for them. And so they take it out on him, and he doesn't handle it. Another thing I draw from Pisgah is that failure is a necessary corollary of leadership. It goes with the job. Max Dupree often says that leaders are only right half the time. Well, that's a lot of wrong that's on the table, and if we're only right half the time, failure is going to go along with the job. Peter Drucker has he has many definitions of leadership, but one of the ones I like is that leadership is the risk of deciding when the alternatives are equal. Think about that. Leadership is the risk of deciding when the alternatives are equal. If they're not equal, if one's clearly better than the other, it doesn't take a leader to make the choice. Leaders have to step up when we don't know. When we don't know which is the right answer, and someone has got to choose and convince people to follow them out on the limb. Could be right, could be wrong. That's when we exercise leadership. And it's that risk that carries with it the very strong reality, perhaps 50-50 as Max says, that we might be wrong. So you're going to fail. And I see Pisgah giving us permission to fail, because God is going to get his people to the promised land. Moses doesn't get to go, but Moses was still sent by God to go out and do his job, and our inability to deliver does not frustrate the sovereign will of God. God is going to accomplish the will of God with or without us, and we are called to follow, to contribute along the way. Failure is a necessary corollary. It's part of the call of God. It embraces failure. We are going to fail, and none of us like it very well at all, but it's part of the reality. It just goes along with the job. Moses failed, Aaron failed, Miriam failed, I've failed, you either have or will fail. Remember when I was a young administrator and Max first made that speech, I vowed that I wasn't going to be one of those. I was going to avoid the failure route by surrounding myself with mentors that I could learn from so I could avoid the pitfalls. Well, I just found my own holes to fall into. Failure goes along with the job. It's the risk of deciding. You're going to choose wrong. And failure requires then forgiveness to be able to survive. And fortunately, Moses climbs one more mountain, the Mount of Transfiguration. And there we see the beautiful, gracious act of God reinstating Moses. As Moses occurs, as Jesus is being transfigured, Moses and Elijah occur with him on the mountain. And I find that kind of wonderful. Moses was called, Moses went out, he was human, he failed, God accomplished what God set out to do, and God said, yeah, that's okay. And is reinstating Moses in this final mountain in his life. Leadership truths then that I would draw from the final mountain: failure's not final. You're going to fail, yes, and it's going to hurt, yes. But God's a lot bigger than that. And you can't damage what God's going to accomplish. So we try, we go. It's kind of like the call is, go, try, I will be with you, and I will accomplish what I set out to do. God will accomplish what we've been called to do. We are called to go and try and learn from the failures. Failure is actually the best learning experience you're going to have. All the research shows us that we learn much more from our failures than from our successes. So you need a few failures for your own growth and development. When I do rock climbing, I don't really like rock climbing, but you have to learn to do it so you can get out of a fix if you find yourself up in a high mountain area. I remember being out on a rock face, and you get out there and your toes are in one crack and your another foot's in a crevice, you got a knob in one hand, and I've got to reach for the next one. And I know I'm going to fall. If I reach for it, I'm going to fall. And so I'm afraid to make the reach. And you get what's called sewing machine leg, where your legs start shaking like crazy, and you know you're going to fall off of this mountain. And I'm roped to Don, and Don says, no, just a little bit farther, just stretch. And I do, and I stretch, and I miss, and I fall. It was absolutely critical that I fall, because that fall taught me to trust the rope. I fell, and I wasn't hurt. What did I fall, 18 inches? Nothing hurt but my pride, because Don caught me on the rope. Once you know that the team is there and the rope is there, the relationships are intact, you can take the risk of the climb. From that point on, I scampered right up the rock face because I wasn't afraid to fall. So part of what we have to have is a culture of forgiveness, a way of relationships around us that give us permission to fall. Jim Collins, who we've talked about already, is an avid rock climber. I mean, he climbs buildings. He just likes this stuff. I do it only to get out of scrapes. But he makes a distinction between failure and failure. And he says, failure is reaching, or I guess he calls it, failure is taking the reach, taking the risk and falling. And then realizing you're not hurt, getting up and taking another risk and going on from there. Failure is being afraid to take the risk so you don't try. And I think that's true for all of us. If we're going to be in leadership, we've got to risk failure and reach for that part beyond us. Because God will accomplish what we've been called to do. With us, in spite of us, without us, if necessary. And that hope gives confidence. Just as the rope catches me when I fall on a rock face, knowing that God's got this call totally under control gives me the hope to take the risk of exercising leadership, even when I don't know what I'm doing. But I still have to accept responsibility and move forward. So 5 truths that I pull out of Moses' life. Leadership begins with the choice to follow. That's where it all begins. This is about God. We are followers. As Tom said, it's about followership first and foremost. Leadership is a relationship of service on a team of gifted persons. We're not solo players. We're not out there by ourselves on our own. We are serving a team of people, all who have been gifted by God to be the Aarons and the Hurs and the Miriams and the contributors to this mission. The culture that we create is a core strategic asset. And in your world, I would argue, it's more than that. It may be the heart of your mission, because your culture is what ultimately is pointing people to the kingdom of God, the way you live together as a community. Leading change, then, causes pain, and it keeps humility alive, because it's going to cost us something to lead people through the change of culture. And without forgiveness, there will be no leadership. You can't exercise leadership if you're not in a place that allows you to fail. And that's kind of where it has to start. When they recruited me to be president of a region, I'd never been a president before. I had a lot of things to say about presidents, but I hadn't tried to do it yet. And the board asked me if I had any questions. And I said, yes, I've never been a president before. What are you going to do when I fail? Well, it's kind of silence. They weren't quite sure. I said, am I done if I fail? Or are you going to pick me up, dust me off, and encourage me to try again? So it matters to me. Organizations have got to provide us with a culture of forgiveness, or we won't take the risk of leadership. Without forgiveness, there is no leadership, which is why the Mount of Transfiguration is so important. So, give you some questions to ponder as you try to sleep tonight. Back to the one from earlier. What gets you up in the morning? It's a way to get at your calling. What gets you up in the morning? Upon whom are you dependent? Who do you need in order to achieve what you've set out to achieve, to be who you intend to be? When was the last time you risked failure and were aware that you were taking the risk? And the biggest question, what do people learn about God by watching you at work? They are watching. I mean, one of the exercises I do in my workshop for CEOs is I show a little video clip from Max Dupree where he's being given an award, and and you have a chance to see him in action. And I say, okay, let's make a list of all the values that shape this man's leadership. And they come out with this wonderful list of characteristics that any of us would like to have after our names. And so we go through that list, and I say, okay, now, tomorrow I'm going to come to your organization and ask your people, what are the values that shape your leadership? What are they going to tell me? And of course, the place gets quite silent. But the reality is, your people have such a list. They all can make that list. They've been talking about it. They know they're watching you, and they know what they believe your values are. And their perception of your values impacts their ability to contribute to your mission and impacts what you can do for the kingdom of God. So, like Charlie Houston, may you almost achieve some of your visions so that others can build on your successes. May your leadership be defined by questions that others will come along and answer. May your relationship with God be so visible that others are encouraged to follow. And may the culture you create be holy ground that produces leaders for this world and followers in our kingdom. So, go, try, set free the people of God to mentor the next generation of leaders with character, calling, relationships, and questions. Thank you.
That's some rich, rich stuff. Now we have time for Q&A. And I'd like to ask Jay Ackerman and Sydney Ord to come forward, and I'll have a couple of roving mics. Those of you who are watching online, you also can participate in this because Mike Kipp is monitoring our Twitter account and also email. So if you have some questions you'd like to send in, please do that. So much going on there. Who would like to begin? Excellent. You want to walk back there? Sure. Oh, sure.
He says, the question here from email says, we have talked a lot about old leadership structures going by the wayside. And while that is true in many cases, it's not always true among non-Caucasian cultures, which are still very much top-down. Yeah. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how we might meet leadership needs in different cultures.
And let me repeat that since folks are watching this online. The basic gist of the question is, there had been mentioned that old kind of top-down hierarchical leadership structures are declining, but that may not be necessarily true in some cultures and some contexts. And Walter to address that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a fair question. And I am clearly talking within the North American context where we do see this breakdown of hierarchical command control leadership and much more of a team horizontal flattened leadership. There are many cultures which are still quite hierarchical. Some of them are changing, and as the younger generation, where the struggle is that the younger generation are more willing to make that change than the older generation are. And so they've got to work within the context of that culture to move within the culture. You can't impose the kind of stuff I'm talking about in a culture that still has the basic authoritarian structures. You've got to work with, for any organization, this applies to every one of our organizations. You go into an organization, you've got to live within the culture you inherit and make your changes from within that context. Same thing is going to be true in an organizational setting or in a culture setting where you have a more hierarchical context. And some places that's going to change more slowly. If you take a company like Brazil, or a country like Brazil, which has had a lot of hierarchical structures, and then you look at the company called Semco. I don't know if anybody ever heard about Semco or Ricardo Semler's work. He's totally taken that company and flipped it upside down and created a completely horizontal company. The employees hire the managers. The employees determine the salaries. The employees determine their work hours. You're not allowed to sit in the same desk 2 days in a row for fear your supervisor might be watching. So the whole thing is an employee-run organization that is highly profitable and highly successful. But we see it written up so much because it's unique within that cultural context. So the question is fair. I mean, there are many cultures where leadership would resist what I'm talking about, and you have to work within the culture of the leadership that you have, but also be true to the person you are and leading in that culture. That's fair.
Excellent. Thanks. Question here? Go on.
One of the things that we face continually in terms of our own structures are people who want to control. And how do you get across to a person who wants to control organizations, control groups, control decisions, in terms of saying, look, we have to turn this around because people who are in the pews are the ones who you want to make decisions. No, I want to control the decision, but no, people in the pew control. How do you get around that?
Excellent.
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we deal with control? And as soon as you asked the question, I immediately had to think, oh, my wife would say that's my problem. And so in some ways it starts there. I mean, there's a little bit of control in all of us. And I also want to control the way things go. I've just gotten to the point where I realize I don't have any control. And so it's a bit of a myth. But we all work in structures where there are people who want to control. And frequently, they either have power or position or family or money, which makes it possible for them to exercise control. And that's a difficult context. I think we do it confrontingly and lovingly. We sit down with the person. We try to help focus on what's the mission. See, in all leadership roles, in my thinking, we got to keep the focus on the mission and the culture. So it's not on the leadership relationship. So it's not so much about my concern whether you or I are going to be in control of outcomes, but together, what do we need to do to get this mission accomplished? What do we need from me? What do you need from me to get the mission accomplished? What does the mission need from you? And so if we can keep it focused together on what God is calling us to do, it allows us to talk about our own insecurities and struggles along the way. But not everybody can listen. Yeah.
Excellent.
Looking out on this crowd, there are probably several ministers here that were trained for their role of ministers about 30 years ago. If Tom gave you the assignment to this group, that you could take this group of people that were trained 30 years ago and train them in such a way that they begin to understand what's going on in the church today, how management needs to change for today. Besides the hierarchical thing, which you've talked about a lot, what are other things that did you get the gist of it?
Yeah, good.
Yeah. What would I say to pastors today, or people training for the church today? Well, first, it would be good to get seminaries to do more leadership training, so I'm really glad for what Tom and others do. But I wouldn't necessarily go to those of us in the seminary for the answer to that question. I'd go to the people in your congregation. And I'd take groups of them together and take them out to lunch and say, tell me about what's going on here. What's working? What's not working? What do you need from me? One of the things I always say to pastors, and I've been saying this for years, if we're really going to be relevant to the people in our congregations, we need to know where the people in our congregations spend their lives. And so I've been challenged pastors to every week go visit one of your parishioners in their workplace or reality setting and stay there long enough to get an illustration for next Sunday's sermon. So you begin to understand the people you're leading. I don't think it's so much an issue of leadership style as it is understanding the people that God's called us to love and what the community around us needs from us as a community expressing God's love.
Excellent. Good. Go to the back.
One that came in from Twitter, and the question is, as culture has been mentioned through the day, how can leaders change culture while upholding tradition, especially in the Nazarene Church?
Changing culture is a very difficult assignment. There's kind of two philosophies of how you change culture. John Cotter out of Harvard wrote a book on leading change, and basically, I hope I'm not unfairly summarizing, when I read that book, what I hear is that you need to create a crisis, a sense of urgency, that people suddenly realize, we got to change, or disaster will occur. That's a dangerous scenario, I think, but that is one of the legitimate argued scenarios. But if you don't go that way, I think you've got to stay in for the long haul. I think it takes 10 to 12 years to change an organizational culture. And it starts with you as the leader, modeling the way you want it to be, and then living consistently out of that, reinforcing those things that are important to the culture, and finding ways to discourage the things that aren't. And over time, if you consistently live out of that set of values, they will begin to get embedded into the culture of the organization that you lead. But it takes a long time. And if you leave your leadership role before it's gotten embedded into the culture, then as soon as you're gone, it'll kick right back into the old tradition will pop in. If you attack the old tradition, you'll also get thrown out. So you've got to work within the tradition and get inside of it and live out the values you believe God is calling you, and then stay there long enough to love them into reality. And that's the painfulness of it. One Regent story on that line is, I didn't have to change the culture of Regent very much. I went into a place that had a culture that I respected very, very highly. We had a few things we needed to tweak. But at one point, the board asked me to write a values statement to go alongside of our mission statement. So I labored over a value statement that kind of captured Colossians 3 and put it into this marvelous stated form that for me was it pulled me into wanting to live that. It's the only thing I've ever written to which the response was unanimous. Everyone rejected it. My wife said, oh, sure, in heaven maybe. So what for me was a compelling ideal picture of what I was striving for everyone else became a measure of judgment and how far we're falling short. Yeah. And so it never got approved. About 4 years later, the chair of the board asked me, what do you do with that document you wrote? I said, oh, I still have it. I use it in my class to illustrate organizational culture. And he said, well, do you still believe it? And I said, yes. He said, are you prepared to be held accountable to it? I said, of course. He said, then why don't you post it on your wall as something you're willing to be held accountable for? So I did. It got blown up and it hung on the president's office for the rest of my 12-year tenure. Never was an official document. But when I resigned to come to the Dupree Center, they let me sit in on the process searching for my successor if I wouldn't kibitz. And so they go through this process, and in the middle of it, somebody reaches into their briefcase, pulls out a copy of this document, they Xeroxed it, passed it around the room, and voted unanimously that that's what they wanted my successor to do. Yes! It's in the culture. So, but it takes time to just live something into a culture for it to take root.
Good.
And if you move too fast, it throws you out.
Let's go back here, and Jay, do you have someone?
Yeah, I've got somebody here, and our mass comm folks have asked to have questioners stand up so that they can catch them on camera.
Great.
It would seem to me that we have an overriding mission that it's been established biblically and by the life of Christ, which is to make disciples, go and make disciples, and all the other part of that. And how would you relate perhaps a failure to do that to our crisis in leadership, and how important is it for us to try to live out that mission?
Well, it is the mission, it is the call, which makes it absolutely important. I mean, everything we do points to the person, to the God we follow. And actually, in the workshop tomorrow, I'll put up a little chart that I walk people through. And when I do that with Christian groups like this, when I get to the God box or the God we follow, we all have a tendency to relax because we know what God we follow. But as you'll see in the chart, the behaviors of your people will teach me as an outside consultant the gods of the leader is following. And Jesus may be one, but your behaviors of your people are going to suggest some other ones got in there. So it's not so much a failure of leadership as it is contaminated theology. That we've allowed ourselves to worship too many things, and that gets reflected in our beliefs that then shape our behaviors and point people. Well, biggest problem is we point people to ourselves instead of to Jesus. But that's the sin that started with Adam and Eve. All I got to do is look at a mirror in the morning, and I know where that problem is. And how to keep people focused on the one we seek to follow and not on ourselves as the visible leaders is a huge challenge.
Excellent. Here again.
Hi there. Hey, you talk about how change creates this need for forgiveness. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about what it may look like to create that space for forgiveness to happen. Maybe if there's an example of an organization you've been able to work with, or just more of the creating space for forgiveness.
It's one of those kind of things you can't really program or set down a policy for all people who make mistakes once will be forgiven. I've always told my teams over the years that I expect them to make mistakes, but I don't expect them to make the same mistake twice. So I expect them to learn from their mistakes. If they aren't making mistakes, they aren't learning. But if they're making the same mistake twice, they're not learning even worse. And so how to illustrate that? The real illustration is what happens when you fail. And can you survive failure? I won't go into it now. If you want to read my book, there's a case in there where I failed miserably and went to see my mentor to basically get his blessing to resign because it was very clear that my leadership was not going to survive. And he gave me his blessing, and of course that freed me up not to resign. And I needed that forgiveness to accept the fact that, yes, I'd failed. Now what am I going to do about it? And then built back up from there. But I don't know how you structure that besides modeling it in the way you treat the people that work for you. It doesn't mean we don't condone sloppy work. We're holding people accountable to quality work in pursuit of the mission, but we're giving them permission to take the risks of leadership and fail once at what they're doing, and then learn from it and move on. And as we model it, we then create the context for others. One of our problems I'm going to get in trouble here probably. One of our problems in religious organizations, we don't allow a lot of room for failure. And we don't like our leaders to fail. So leaders are afraid to be vulnerable. And I think we do a disservice to the kingdom. I mean, God, that's the whole message of God, is that the forgiveness is there available for us. We've got to create churches and organizations that take us as human beings in our vulnerable attempts to provide leadership as they move forward in their own journeys in the kingdom. And we've got to create places that have a culture of forgiveness about them. But it's easy to say that. I can't do anything to implement it besides model it in my behaviors with others.
We're down here. Yes. Would you stand? Yeah, that would be great.
It's actually a question on the generational differences. In your search or research or whatever, do you find that Generation X people are more receptive to women in leadership roles than possibly us baby boomers? That's what I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's probably people that have done more research in the area that could respond to that better than I can. But I think that would be true, that you would see more women moving into leadership roles in the Gen X group. I think some of it was happening with the boomer group. One thing about Gen X, they don't like being called Gen X. So my wife told me, don't use those terms when you talk, because they don't like it. I mean, and none of us like to be pigeonholed. None of us fit anywhere that tightly. But yeah, I think there is increasing embrace of diversity in all ways as we move through.
Okay, let's go over this direction next.
Hi, do you have, in addition to the Max Dupree resources and the books on the tables, do you have like 3 go-to resources that you would recommend for people who want to continually get into this study of leadership, and especially the generational stuff that you've been talking about?
I don't do enough with the generational stuff to be able to give you off the top of my head the books and the resources that I would draw from. There are a lot of good things out there, and Tom and others probably can tell you what they are. I can't. I have certain leadership books that I go back to, and of course Max Dupree. You should all have read Max Dupree's Leadership as an Art, and maybe Leadership Jazz, and maybe Leading Without Power, and Called to Serve. I mean, all 4 of those books are worth pursuing. Other books that I lean on heavily, Daniel Goleman's work out of Harvard and his book Primal Leadership. I actually require all the Dupree Fellows to read that at the same time I have them reading Gene Lippman-Blumen's The Allure of Toxic Leadership. Because both books recognize that leadership is really an emotional relational connection, and that we're basically influencing people through this emotional connection. And the primal leader understands the power of that emotional reality and manages it appropriately. The toxic leader understands the power of it and uses it for their own benefit. So primal leadership is one that I refer to. Allure of Toxic Leadership is one that I use a lot. Ron Heifetz's work out of Harvard, almost anything he's written is worth reading. His stuff is very, very good. He wrote the Leadership No Easy Answers, Leadership on the Line. Those are 2 of them, are recent ones. Both are very good books.
Excellent. Let's go over this direction now.
You were talking again about the generations, and my question is, I see a lot in the church that we have a lot of younger leaders that aren't just in charge or have a leadership position that involves people even younger than themselves, but it involves the older generations. Wow. So how do you say, or some practical ways that those younger leaders can help their congregation or their organization realize the realities of a changing culture, but still respect the wisdom of the older generations and receive mentorship from those older generations?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I get that often. I don't know if I have an answer for it, but I hear that often, because more and more young leaders are stepping into leadership roles and then finding themselves leading older leaders who struggle a bit with that reality. And I think about the only thing I can say is be conscious of their struggle and try to understand where they are. And the older they are, they may think you're just kind of young to be a leader and to be having answers yet, that you haven't kind of earned your stripes to be able to give the direction. And so you need to come in humbly and honestly, vulnerably, but with all the gifts and knowledge and wisdom and commitment that you have. So you can't hold back because of that, but you've got to be sensitive to the fact that my generation and the generation before me expected you to have put in some years before you told us what to do. And that's not the way it is right now. You're ready to tell us what to do right now. And that's good. But I have to get used to it. So you got to kind of take me along gently. But no, that's a good question, and it's a reality.
Thanks. Let's go to the web again.
Walter, in a similar vein, this came in from Twitter, and the question is, do we set young ministers up for failure when we tell them, quote, "you are young and naive," end of quote, in relation to ministry and their dreams?
Do we set them up for failure? See, I'm old and naive. And I think naive is kind of good, but it gets used in a negative way. I like to think of idealism rather than naivety. And that statement that I wrote that got totally rejected was an idealistic statement. The young leaders have a lot of idealism, and that has to be cherished and encouraged and released, and we need to avoid using naivety, because that's a way we kind of negate that yes, they don't have as much experience, but they still have ideas, and they have energy, and they have the willingness to get behind their ideas and make them happen. And so one of the things that leaders have to do, and this may come out tomorrow night with Tom and Ed's conversation, when they're talking about institutionals and entrepreneurs. One of the jobs of leadership is to create space for the younger entrepreneurial people to be able to bring their ideas to fruition. And part of our job is to protect them so they can run with it and make it happen. They got ideas that I'm never going to think about, and they have the energy to make them happen that I don't have anymore. But I can protect space for them to run with that idea. And I think that's part of our job as leaders is to do that. Yeah.
Excellent. Back over this direction now.
Yeah, I had a question about the generations. And
I should never have brought up generations.
when you observe us, the younger generations, what would you say we could do to best become better leaders and even more so better learners?
The thing that, well, I don't want to discourage what you're doing at all, because the energy you bring to the organizations is exactly what we need right now. Probably what people that have been kind of in the trenches for the last 15 or 20 years want to know is that you're also listening, that you also value where they've poured their life and energy. I mean, if they've given 10, 15, 20 years to a church or an organization, they got a deep investment in this place. And they want to know that you care about that, and that you hear them and you hear what they've been trying to accomplish. And it's in the process of communicating that hearing, you're going to learn some things in the process too, but they have a chance then to hear you as you ask questions. So you can also lead with questions the same way I'm encouraging any leader to lead with questions. You go in, you take them out to lunch and start asking them questions. What makes you tick? Why are we doing it this way? What gets you excited? What's God done in your life lately? And through the questions, you begin to understand what they're trying to accomplish, and through the questions, they begin to understand who you are and what you want to accomplish. But don't stop being you, but help the people that have been in the trenches a while to know that you are listening and not just talking, which is true for all of us. I mean, I'm a trained educator. Max Dupree is a trained question asker. I'm an answer giver. And I've had to learn that that's not good leadership. Good leadership is asking questions. As I said earlier, giving answers just shuts it down.
I've got a question for you. A lot of leaders do a lot and sometimes get burned out. I'm conscious of this quote from John Wesley right behind me. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can. Some people read that and just go, you got to be kidding. I'm going to be run ragged. What do leaders do to help create some space so that they don't burn out, run ragged, do so much that they actually become ineffective?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of things we could talk about that. When you read that was my first response, and then I looked at can and thought, that's a pretty small word, and that limits what I can do. Can. That gives me room to say, that's all I can do. One of the realities that you're alluding to in that question is in any leadership role, there's more work to be done than you possibly have time and energy to do. You can't do it all. And if you try, you're just going to burn out. So you've got to understand your limits. And we talked earlier about introverts and extroverts. And say, I know my limits as an introvert. I'm going to crash tonight when I get off of the stage, hopefully soon. And I know that about myself, so I'm not going to be in here early in the morning tomorrow. I'm going to give myself some time to sleep in and recover. So you need to understand your limits. You need a mentor who can call you to account when you're overworking yourself and taking on too many things. You need to give people permission. My wife always says, don't say you need to. I believe that I have to give people permission to speak into my life and ask me the questions about, what am I doing here? How am I taking care of myself? Am I being realistic? So I would see knowing your limits, having mentors. I'm also a strong advocate for small groups, that I think everybody needs to belong to a small accountability group that does hold them accountable to how they're investing their lives. And I've belonged to small groups that meet weekly now for 43 years, and I can't imagine not being in a small group. And so that becomes, and then the fourth one is exercise. If you're going to do leadership at all, you got to take care of yourself physically, because that exercise is absolutely critical to your ability to stay alive and vital. Otherwise, leadership will kill you. That's why I climb mountains. So.
I've noticed several times you haven't mentioned it directly, but indirectly, you've shown us that one of the important influences in your life is your wife. Because you said, my wife says I should say this. Talk to us as your final, we'll get you off stage here. As the final thing, how does your relationship with your wife affect you and your thinking about leadership? Because you've mentioned her many times.
Oh yeah, that could start a whole nother conversation. Well, again, see, relationship is a very high value for me. And leadership is a relationship, but it cannot undermine my primary relationships, which is with God and my family. And so Beverly and I will celebrate 50 years now in June, and it's been a lot of hard work. But I've been committed to my wife, and I've been committed to my 2 sons, and now my 4 grandchildren. And I actually turned down every request to be a president or a dean until my youngest son went away to college, because I didn't want to be a president and a father. I couldn't do both jobs, I didn't think. And not everybody would agree with that. When Regent asked me to take a 3rd term, I called my sons. And I said, I don't want to be a president and a grandfather. So, what's the prognosis? They both assured me I could take another term. And so I did, but interesting enough, in God's timing, when I did end up resigning 3 years later to come down to the Dupree Center, we had our first grandson. And so that did work out. But I think that's a high commitment for me. And Beverly is the place where I think out loud about everything. And she's been the place where I test things. She's my biggest critic and my biggest fan. And if you want to pray for me, the big issue now is I'm home too much. And that is a major issue for people retiring. I mean, there's been more and more divorces occurring now called the graying of divorce, because couples haven't figured out how to live in the same small space together. Beverly loves it when I travel. She's glad I'm here.
Well, let's thank Walter Wright for his excellent talk tonight. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.